The most effective classification system ever invented is not a locked file cabinet or a server behind a firewall. It is the certainty that anything I say publicly will be dismissed as fiction. For the past 8 years, I have worked for a division of the federal government that doesn't have a public-facing name. I just call it the Office. Officially, we operate under the Department of the Interior, but in practice, I answer only to my handler, Delia Marsh. My job is simple. I find things the government created or allowed to happen, and I deal with them before the public finds out. One Tuesday morning, Delia called me about a drainage ditch in eastern Montana where a highway worker had been hospitalized after seeing something. Eastern Montana is a place of infinite blue walls and flat, dry grassland that goes on forever. I found the site. A standard concrete culvert, 4 feet in diameter and 60 feet long. I entered from the north side with a flashlight and a sidearm. It should have taken 30 seconds to cross. But at 60 steps, the point where I should have been out the other side, the pipe was still going. I turned back. The entrance was a tiny pinprick of light, far more distant than it should have been. The culvert was physically longer on the inside than the outside. As I pushed deeper, the air turned warm and wet, smelling not of rot, but of something alive, like breathing in the heat from the belly of a horse. The walls were no longer bare concrete. They were coated in a dark, slick sheen. 200 feet into a 60-foot pipe, I found it. A mass of dark red, vascular biological tissue was fused into the concrete. Thick veins pulsed with a slow, heavy rhythm that I could feel vibrating through the soles of my boots. It wasn't an animal. It was an organ that had colonized the space, growing for 50 years since the government conducted soil testing there in the 60s. The pipe had become its body. I backed out slowly, realizing that for half a century, every car and truck on that highway had been driving over a beating heart. The office sealed it under a concrete cap and called it an emergency road repair. But I still lie awake thinking about it. How many other miles of highway are built over something that is currently breathing in the dark? Once you know, you can't unlearn it. You just carry the weight of the silence. I drove into a valley in west central Utah where a rancher named Boyd Sutter reported his cattle were acting like statues. When I arrived, I saw 112 animals, even though Boyd only owned 80. They stood in concentric rings, shoulder to shoulder, facing inward toward a center I couldn't see. The ones in the outer ring looked normal, but the ones in the second and third rings had proportions that were fundamentally wrong: legs too long, heads angled at impossible degrees, and hides that looked like painted plastic. They weren't animals anymore. They were biological mimics grown from the soil, fueled by atmospheric dispersal tests the government conducted in the 70s. I stood there in the absolute silence of the valley, realizing the extra cattle were waiting for me to step into the circle so they could learn how to shape a human. After I reported the Utah herd, the office sent in a 6-man tactical and veterinary team. I watched from the ridge as they approached the outer ring with their equipment. The team leader's last radio transmission was calm, almost hypnotic. He said the cattle were beautifully still. Then the radio went dead. When the recovery unit arrived the next morning, the trucks were still idling and the radios were lying in the dirt, but the 6 men were gone. No blood, no struggle, and no tracks leaving the area. The cattle hadn't moved an inch, but their numbers had increased by exactly 6. The office didn't try again. They simply fenced off the valley and wiped the maps clean, leaving those men to stand in the heat, frozen in a shape that used to be human. In May, I was sent to southeastern Oregon to investigate the Linden property. Chad Linden, a former BLM employee, claimed the 6 acres behind his house were vibrating and radiating heat. When I walked the perimeter, I felt it. A low-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. The sagebrush inside the warm zone was a vibrant, neon green, thriving in the freezing high desert winter. Chad told me his well water had turned sweet and metallic, and his 12-year-old son had started sleepwalking, standing barefoot on the vibrating earth for hours in the middle of the night. Records showed the land sat atop a 1960s deep well injection site where the Department of Energy disposed of experimental fluids. The earth wasn't just warm. It was waking up, and it was calling to the boy. I remember a job in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey where a suburban basement began to grow teeth. A homeowner had called about a strange calcification on his foundation. By the time I arrived, the walls were covered in jagged, ivory-colored protrusions that were chemically identical to human enamel. The office had used the neighboring lot for frequency resonance trials in the 90s, and the local limestone had begun to crystallize into organic structures. As I scraped a sample, the house groaned, and I realized the protrusions weren't just growing on the wall. The entire house was being converted into a mouth. We condemned the block, citing a gas leak, and watched from a distance as the structure slowly began to chew itself into splinters. There was a radio tower in a remote corner of New Mexico that had been broadcasting a signal for 3 weeks that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't music or speech. It was the sound of a woman crying, but slowed down by 400%. I climbed the maintenance ladder in a windstorm, my skin prickling with static electricity so thick I could smell ozone. At the top, I found the transmitter encased in a translucent, amber-like resin that was warm to the touch. Inside the resin, trapped like a prehistoric insect, was a standard government-issued encrypted drive from 1985. The drive was empty, but the resin was the source of the broadcast. It was a physical manifestation of data, a ghost in the machine that had grown a physical body to keep its scream alive. 2 years after the Utah incident, I looked at a classified satellite feed of the valley. The herd was still there, unchanged by time or weather. But the thermal imaging showed something new. The heat wasn't coming from the cattle. It was coming from a single point beneath them, a rhythmic flare of energy that matched a human heartbeat. The mimics weren't just standing. They were acting as a biological heat sink for something cooling deep underground. I realized then that the government hadn't just accidentally released a substance. They had planted a seed. The cattle were the soil, the mimics were the roots, and whatever was at the center was finally starting to bloom.